Well, it is a race to net zero and to keep 1.5 degrees alive. And to get there, we need radical solutions, not to mention $7 trillion annually. But that's just an estimate. The figure changes according to who you speak to. So how do you get all the stakeholders, regulators, investors, companies, to come together to find a more cohesive and strategic response? Samaila, let's start with you, because we know that climate is a huge issue for Africa. It loses something like $7 to $15 billion a year because of climate. How are you looking? What is your approach when it comes to climate?
Thank you very much for that question. I think in 2022, we published a white paper on Africa's pragmatic path to net zero. There we argued that in spite of Africa not being responsible for most of the greenhouse gas emissions, and the fact that we're the most severely impacted by the adverse impacts of climate, we can play a big part in the solutions. And we argued that Africa's best part is not to reduce emissions that we don't have right now, and that there's a window for us to have a different trajectory for growth. Actually, most of the developing countries have an opportunity to take a different growth path so that that is less carbon intensive and has less emissions. So our view is Africa has over 40% of the minerals and resources that are required for the energy transition, because the energy transition is going to be electric. It means that it will be electrified going forward. And Africa has a lot of those minerals and metals. It also has significant renewable energy sources to process those minerals and metals with the least carbon intensity. So if you think of the fact that the world is going to go electric, you need lithium-ion batteries, you need copper, cobalt, you need wires, bauxite, so all of those things are in Africa. And in Africa, you can process them, with renewable energy sources. So the International Energy Association tells us that we have 10,000 gigawatts of solar potential with just 1% built. We have 110 gigawatt potential of wind energy with just about 11 gigawatts built. We have 15 gigawatts of geothermal energy with less than 1 gigawatt built. We have 400 gigawatts of thermal gas potential with less than 5% built. And if we're going to move significantly, to an electric world, it only makes sense that these minerals and metals are processed in Africa. And we're working on several initiatives around that. We have special economic zones and industrial parks that we've built and are transforming African produce and African minerals and metals into semi-finished and finished goods. We are just about to start processing the minerals and metals. We are now focused on adaptation. Again, we argue that Africa's infrastructure is yet to be built. So in building infrastructure going forward, we need to incorporate climate risks in fiscal Africa to build. And we are raising an infrastructure climate resilience fund, where we got Green Climate Fund to work with us on a blended finance architecture, whereby they're providing the first loss, and we are raising second loss from ourselves and our counterparts, pension funds, and sovereign wealth funds as well, to demonstrate that there is capacity within Africa to fund the energy transition, and we are making steps to fund that. We are also focused on how to increase energy access, and we are investing in renewable energy. We're actually one of the largest renewable energy investors on the continent today, and we have recently commissioned a wind farm in Djibouti that is going to move the country to their part. They have chosen a part that they want to be 100% powered by renewable energy, and we are helping them on that part. And there are many initiatives that we're working on, across solar and wind in Egypt, in South Africa, in Kenya, geothermal in Kenya, wind, solar in Senegal. All across the continent, there is potential for us to advance the energy transition. Our
Samaila,
focus has been on developing to de-risk, and then inviting partners to work with us.
we'll build on some of the things that you said slightly later. Secretary Dungo, for Kenya, it's also critical, right? I mean, you just had a flooding, which caused the deaths of more than 200 people. How are you doing things differently, looking at climate differently?
Thank you very much indeed, and I'm very happy to be here. But let me also say that the person who was invited to this forum was His Excellency, the President of the Republic of Kenya, so I substituted him. And you could have seen.
We're glad to have you with us.
You could have had more drama with the champion of climate change in Africa, that is President William Ruto. Let me say that as the Cabinet Secretary to the National Treasury, the whole issue is why am I talking about the net zero? It's because just like you have mentioned, we have had a drought in 2022, one of the major droughts, followed by El Nino, and now we have maybe one of the most devastating flood season in Kenya. And that tells you the severity of the problem. From my end, is diversion of fiscal resources to cater for lives, to save lives. You can imagine that we cannot even talk about what he said. We have 93% of our energy as renewable. And I would agree with him, investing in this renewable is very, very important. But for us, even the transmission is going to be more critical. But can we manage to do that? We cannot manage to do that because you can see we have layers and layers of severe negative climatic shocks. So they have diverted a lot of space, fiscal space into that. But then, let me go back to your question. I think the first thing is actually to recognize that we have to shift. We have to make a proper shift in terms of investing in adaptation and resilience. And that's very, very critical. And it has to start from the low end. We have like the tree planting, for example, across. Over the weekend, I was even giving school children fruit trees, because I believe that that is where we have to start in terms of the investment we need to change. The ecological restoration is going to be very, very critical. And that for us is very, very important. And then we go into, for example, we were excited when we started talking about climate change and carbon markets. But there are difficulties even creating that kind of regulations required in terms of entry into that space, and even the whole spectrum of what we really need to do in terms of changing the technological transformation that is required to resolve this is quite massive. And so we are working on different fronts. And can I say, there are so many moving parts. And we have to make sure that we predefine where we start in all these moving parts so that we have a tractable path of net zero, investment in net zero. There are so many aspects of that, but I can come back to those later. But for now, I think a whole range of, let's say, transformative, innovative thinking is required in this area, so that we not only move in a tractable path, but at the same time, we first of all deal with the most, should I say, serious, imposing factors that are inhibiting us even from thinking beyond the path that we want to take.
And Dr. Maryam, for the UAE, has a huge carbon footprint. It's about greening the whole economy, not just growing the green economy.
Yes.
Put that in perspective for us.
Okay. Well, let me start by thanking the QEF and Bloomberg for this opportunity. The subject of sustainability is very relevant now. And the UAE is conscious of its carbon footprint, which is clearly reflected by its giant efforts at sustainability. So the UAE's, there are a lot of plans in the UAE. Now we are looking into having a mix of energy. That we have the UAE Energy Strategy 2050. So we are now exploring a different mix of energy to, of course, fuel the economy of its needs, along with also looking into environmental also goals. So we have now renewable, we have nuclear, as well as clean sources, clean energy sources. So all of this, of course, we are taking into account that we need to have those powers in order to serve the economic requirement of the UAE as well as environmental sustainability. So to give you an example, I mean, we have now, we are also exploring different, like peaceful, the UAE peaceful energy, the peaceful energy program, nuclear program. It's very successful. We have, it plays a major role in decarbonizing. We have also Al Baraka nuclear energy plant, which is expected to save up to 22 million tons of carbon emissions each year. And also we have in the UAE the biggest three solar plants in the world. And the lowest cost. They are the largest and the lowest cost. So the Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum Solar Park, it's the single point solar park in the world, and it's the largest single point, and it is expected to reduce over 6.5 million tons of carbon credit, carbon emission when completed. So, I mean, and what better proof of our commitment than hosting the global community of, to fight climate change, which is as the host of COP28. So the COP28 declaration called the UAE, consensus is like it was the historic agreement to transition away from fossil fuels. So all of this, I mean, that shows how serious the UAE is taking the matter.
And Jim, we talk about the climate revolution, right? I mean, you have 30 years under your belt. I think 3 years in climate specifically. How does this climate revolution differ to other investment waves that you've seen in your career?
It's fascinating to sit on this panel. I was wondering what I'm doing here. I guess that I'm the practitioners. We have policy, we have development finance, we have markets, but my goal is actually to get the money going. And for those of you I don't know, I run the world's largest private equity fund focused on climate. And what I can bring is a bit of an on-the-ground perspective. So I think we have a lot to learn from the technology revolution. And it actually starts with perception. I don't know how many of you go to tech conferences. They're the same as climate conferences. Same bad coffee, same bad buffet. But the sound is very different. In a tech conference, everything is going to happen tomorrow. We're going to have self-driving cars in 2 years. AI is taking over the world the day after tomorrow. And everything is possible. When you go to a climate conference, we're never going to fix the grid in 50 years, and pestilence and death is there for all of us. Now, all of those things may be right. But we've spent so long focused on the need side of the coin that I'm not sure we've flipped it over to see the opportunity side of the coin. And the $7 trillion a year that has to be spent will not come if there's not $7 trillion probably of profit attached to it. And so one of the things we can learn from technology is that we have to define not only the need, but the opportunity. Policy moves on need, business moves on opportunity. Yes. And I think we've been so focused for so long and so rightly on the need here that we may actually be missing the opportunity. The other thing we've learned in climate is that it takes focus. You cannot be a tourist in the climate area. In the tech area, the people who were in the middle of it, who had a deep understanding of what was happening, were the people who actually saw the way and built the progress. One of the issues that I think we all have in the climate world is it's dispersed. There hasn't yet formed up a leadership outside of policy on how this is going to happen. And I think what we can learn about platforms, about business models, and how they can be applied to change can be transitioned from technology to climate.
You talk about opportunity and meeting the needs. It's also about returns to incentivize investors. And AFC, I know, have done pretty well in terms of getting those returns. Talk to us what you've done differently to get there.
Thank you for that. So again, like Jim mentioned, we've tried to look at the opportunity. And for us, the opportunity is developing to de-risk, so that you can make a case that is investable. And once you prove an investable case, working with partners to deploy that capital, innovating as you go to move from spending 5 years to get to financial close after you put in the equity, to finding ways to do construction finance, equity bridge, so that you can move away from thinking about whether a project will happen to actually looking at the cash flows from the project. So what we've done in the most recent project we commissioned, as soon as we got the PPA agreed with the government, we got a political risk guarantee in place. We just went to tender, and we got the technology provider, proven track record, and we provided a construction finance instrument so that to build out the plant. So by the time we were talking to lenders, they could see the wind farm, they could see the masts, they could actually see the grid connection being in place, they could see transition lines, so they knew that we just have to look at the potential cash flows that will come through. And then we do that because Africa is perceived to be so risky, but the reality is not so. So what we are trying to do always is to move people closer to the reality as opposed to the perception of risk in Africa. And our returns, like you mentioned, demonstrate that we're actually more profitable than most listed infrastructure funds. So if you look at our returns over the last 12 years, they've been stellar. And what we do is constantly develop to de-risk and distribute to partners, reduce the perception of risk, show actual results. Like I mentioned, we just are commissioning a wind, solar, and storage farm in Morocco to provide 8% of the energy requirements of the United Kingdom. Again, that is to demonstrate that Africa has the potential to work for itself and the rest of the world.
Right.
I want to punctuate this. All of us understand the opportunity, the need, but I want you to think about cell phones when you think about energy in Africa. There was a moment in 2000 where Africa basically leapfrogged. It just went right around landlines and built into a new technology, and some of the most interesting financial inclusion tools in the world came out of that. So we have to transition energy in Africa, but actually energy addition allows us to leapfrog if we focus on the opportunity, not just the need.
And also for Kenya, your power generation is green. How are you leveraging that, and and what kind of financing needs do you have to help you advance that even more?
That is how I was going to ring fence his point about policies need and also opportunities coming from private sector, because essentially we do imagine that the cost of transition is massive and we cannot make it. But the private sector is there. Private sector is there. It doesn't have constraints like individual governments. It doesn't have constraints in terms of finance, but it also doesn't have constraints in terms of technology. And the third one is that it is very sensitive to time to build. So in a sense, they can actually make sure that it moves with speed. We have a major cost in terms of upcoming transition cost, but we also have a massive cost in terms of debt. So you can imagine those two are inhibiting and pushing us to a low equilibrium trap. And that is why taking advantage of the private sector in terms of its own capacity and resources and also technology available becomes very, very important, so that we take advantage of that to actually bring the private sector to act. Then it means that we have to provide the policy space for them to act. So in actual fact, the solution is the policy space.
And for the UAE, capital is actually growing. When it comes to green bonds, Sukuk issuances, you saw a record, and that's because of some of the measures that you've implemented.
Yes. Well, I represent the Securities and Commodities Authority, Capital Markets Regulatory Authority, and so since I spent like a substantial part of my life in this career, I have seen it. The regulators have has to play important role in influencing the dialogue and efforts to contain climate change, as well as to drive sustainability. So in the UAE Net Zero 2050 strategic plan or initiative, which aligns with the Paris Agreement, as well as the UAE Green Strategy 2030 target. It aims toward having sustainable efforts in this regard. So, of course, I mean, it's a long journey, and if you have such a long journey, you have like a strategic objective, you need to break it into smaller goalposts. One of the first goalposts is to have a common understanding of objectives. That is to have a common taxonomy. And then all relevant regulators should come together to one platform and join hands. We have done this, and we have started that in the UAE. All the regulators, ministries, authorities have formed the Sustainable Finance Working Group, which is, I mean, it contains all, the regulator in the UAE, and we have agreed on 3 public statements. One is like enhancing sustainability-focused corporate governance, bolstering disclosure, sustainability-related disclosure and sustainability reporting, and also having a taxonomy specific to the UAE.
Right.
Yeah. So I mean, as well as you said, in regard to the SCA, the Securities and Commodities Authority, we have issued. I mean, we have classified some bonds and sukuk as green. Just of course to encourage companies, and we had a big issuance, and also to reward them, we exempted regularity fees from this issuance, as well as mandating sustainability report for investors in the annual reporting.
We talked about how we need radical solutions, innovation. Jim, I mean, is there any climate innovation that you're excited about, that you've seen out there? Pockets of innovation, perhaps?
So many. We're cracking natural gas and making hydrogen and clean carbon black for tires. We have EV toll companies that are electrifying air travel. We have new SAF technologies that are going to allow us to actually suck carbon out of the air and make it into jet fuel. What I'd like to leave with this group is on the front lines, we've met with 1,200 companies. There are solutions there. There is a sorting function that needs to go on. There is a lack of human capital who understand the peripheral vision of what's happening in this market. But beyond the need, what I'm seeing on the ground is extraordinary opportunity. And that transition of how we talk about this, there's a passing of the baton. It started with the scientists, it moved to the policymakers, it moved to those of you who are getting these markets open. Now it needs to move to the people in this room to run the last leg. And what I'm finding is the last legs tend to be pretty fast when you run it, and it's happening much faster on the ground than it is in the discussion. And if we can get some of that speed understood, we'll remind ourselves that capital is going to be the feedstock of this revolution, and all of us need to get the capital moving, and the capital will move to opportunity.
Where would you like capital to go to in Kenya?
I would like capital to go, for example, into renewable energy, because that is actually which can make the whole difference, which can connect us to the land, maybe smart agriculture, industrialization, and support the value chains that we have.
And that's the cheapest energy in the world today.
That is the cheapest energy in the world, but even investing in that cheap energy, I talked about transmission channels. But at the end of the day, I need to support his point that at the end of the day, for us to create that momentum, we need to change the institutional DNA. Institutions must be there to develop markets and protect markets. The institutional DNA, I have 2 qualities for them. The first one is actually to uphold the legal framework. And the second DNA that I define as DNA is actually define the appropriate incentive structure. That is the reward structure. A combination of the legal framework and the appropriate incentives is going to encourage prudent behavior in the marketplace. And that is what is going to give us the drive. Thank you.
Just quickly, we're running out of time. I just wanted to talk about carbon credit, I mean, you talked about how it's failing us, Samaila, but you say Africa needs to be the center of it. Very briefly, why and how?
So I think we need to focus on what carbon credit support is about: preserving forests, preserving peatlands, and preserving all the systems that can absorb carbon dioxide, the natural system that can absorb carbon dioxide. So the focus should be on preserving them. And our view is that the current practice of trying to just, I would say, feel good about pollution is not the way. I think we should focus on how can we provide alternative livelihoods, for people that are cutting down the trees. We need to keep the trees in the ground. We need to provide them alternative livelihoods. We need to have a clear focus on the 900 million people that don't have access to clean cooking and provide them alternatives. So it's by having the capital to develop good projects that can conserve the forest, that can conserve the peatlands, and that can absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That is the way to advance carbon credits.
Samaila, Secretary Dungu, Jim, Dr. Maryam, thank you so much for your time. I think we needed at least an hour for this conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you.